In this segment, we're going to consider bones from the perspective that they are organs, and recall that organs are a structure that have two or more tissue types and fulfill some common function. So first what we're going to take a look at is we're going to take a look at bone shapes, and we have essentially four basic bone shapes. We have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. We'll next take a look at the other tissues that are associated with the bone and their functions as well. So we'll see some other connective tissues, some nervous tissues, as well as some epithelial tissues. And then we'll also look at, in kind of continuing the discussion of bone shapes, we'll look at the projections and the openings on the surfaces of bones and what their basic function is. So to start off our discussion of bone shapes, we'll begin with long bones. And long bones, as its name implies, is a bone in which the length of the bone is greater than its width. And typically these bones are associated with the appendages, that is, they're found in the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So they give length to these particular structures here. So they're typically associated with the appendicular skeleton. The femur is the long bone that occupies the thigh, which is the region between the hip here. This is where the hip or the pelvic bones would articulate with the femur, and the knee. So the femur simply sits between the hip and the knee, or occupies the region between the hip and the knee. Likewise, there are long bones in anatomically what we call the arm and the leg. So the two bones that form the leg, which is the region between the knee and the ankle, are the tibia and the fibula, and the radius and ulna occupy the forearm, which is the region that is between the elbow and the wrist. And the bones of the hand, or at least most of the bones associated with the hand, are long bones as well. So the metacarpals are the bones that constitute the palm or make up the region underneath the palm of our hand, and the phalanges are long bones associated with the digits or the fingers of the hand. And so those are the long bones. Short bones, on the other hand, they're really exactly the opposite of long bones, in that these are bones that are roughly equal in length and width. That is, they're equal in dimension, or they're approximately cube-shaped. Typically, these are found in the wrist and the ankles. In the wrist, we collectively call the wrist bones the carpals, and we have 8 carpal bones, which we won't, each one does have a specific name, but we're not going to learn the names of every single carpal bone when we get to the skeleton. But the carpals collectively make up the wrist. Collectively, the tarsals make up what we consider the ankle bones. And there are 7 ankle bones per foot, or 7 tarsals per foot. And again, we won't learn every single name of those bones, but we'll take a look at some of them. I want to talk here briefly about a special type of short bone that's called a sesamoid bone. And a sesamoid bone is essentially a special type of short bone that develops within the tendon of a muscle. So often what you get are muscle tendons that cross joints, and you get a small bone that develops within that tendon, really to kind of help the tendon kind of glide over the joint and the bones of that particular joint, and the bone within it, that is the sesamoid bone, helps prevent damage to that tendon as it glides over that particular joint. In this case, or in this example that I've given here, one example of a sesamoid bone is the patella, which makes up the bone that we more generally call our kneecap. And this bone is found within a tendon of a large tendon of a muscle that crosses the anterior part of our knee joint. So it really helps this tendon glide over the knee joint without incurring any damage as a result of that movement there. And the patella isn't the only type of sesamoid bone in the body, but it's really our most prominent example. So I'll just kind of leave the discussion with that one. As I mentioned before, the patella, or the sesamoid bones in general, help to protect tendons from abrasion as they glide over the joints that they cross. Our third type of bone that we'll take a look at is a flat bone, and these are thin bones that sometimes are curved in their shape, but these are usually flattened or thinned bones. And bones, our third bone shape that we'll take a look at are the flat bones, and as their name implies, these are thin bones, but they are also sometimes curved, so they're not perfectly flat in that regard. A couple of examples, prominent examples that we'll take a look at is the sternum, and so this is the bone that makes up the anterior part of the thoracic cage, where all the ribs articulate with. Commonly, we call this one the breastbone, but our sternum is considered a flat bone. The scapulae, which are the bones that we more generally call the shoulder blades, and these, while they do have a number of projections coming off of them, these are generally considered flat bones, simply because of their thinness, and they are a little bit curved. Most of the cranial bones, not all of them, are what we consider flat bones. So most of the bones that make up the bony cage that surrounds the brain are what are collectively known as the cranial bones. And most of these are flat. Not all of them are flat, but most of these are considered flat bones. And last but not least, we'll take a look at the irregular shaped bones. And as their name implies, these are bones that are shaped in a way that is not easily classifiable in the category of long, short, or flat bones. So these are really just bones with extremely irregular shapes that don't fit any of the above classifications. The vertebrae are a good example, or singular vertebra in this case. This is a vertebra from the thoracic region of our vertebral column. Those are considered irregular bones simply because they have a number of projections that come off of them, and they're really kind of very strangely shaped. And this bone here, which doesn't look particularly familiar from the skeletal point of view, but this is a bone called the sphenoid bone, which is actually a cranial bone. This is one of the cranial bones that is not considered a flat bone, but as you can see, it has these very elaborate sort of wing-like processes that come off of it, and it's a very complex shape for a bone. And so this is one example of an irregular bone. Now these aren't the only two examples of irregular bones, but they give you a good idea of the types of shapes that you'll encounter in this category. Now bones aren't just smooth. Now bones are not these smooth and featureless structures. What you'll notice when we get into the skeletal system is that bones have a number of projections, rough surfaces, openings within them, passageways through them. So bones are not just these featureless structures. They have blood vessels that need to cross through them, that need to cross into them. They have nerves that need to pass by them. They have a number of muscles that need to anchor and attach to them. So they have these sort of various projections and openings within them that allow those muscles, those blood vessels, and those nerves to anchor or to pass through them. So they have many projections and openings associated with them. As I mentioned, many of these are entry and exit of nerves and blood vessels through bones. Muscle and ligament attachment is particularly important. A number of these projections also form joints between two bones. So we'll see some examples of characteristics or features on bones, or what the book calls bone markings, that are particularly important in forming bone-to-bone joints in the skeleton. I won't go through all these here, but we'll go through these in lab. Table 8.1 will get you started on the name of what the book refers to as bone markings. So there are some that are projections where muscles and ligaments will attach to, some that help form joints, and some that allow passages of blood vessels and nerves. And so there are several terms in each of these categories here, and it has a description of each one. So please, I would say, take time to go through those and make sure you're comfortable with and familiar with those, as we'll be learning some of these features on bones that'll be particularly important to identify when we get to the skeletal system. So we'll see these when we get to the skeleton. So here, be able to name each of the features of bones, or the markings that you see here, and be able to describe it at the very least. So, okay. So bones, we've looked at the shapes of bones, but we haven't really discussed the size of bones. And it turns out that bones come in a really good variety of sizes. So they're not all large bones. Some bones are, in fact, very, very small. Some of the smallest bones, in fact, that are associated with the skeleton are what are collectively referred to as the middle ear ossicles. So these are 3 bones that are found within the middle ear that help conduct sensory information from the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane here, to the sensory structure of the ear, which is called the cochlea. So essentially they provide a little mechanical arm that when the tympanic membrane vibrates, it moves a fluid within this the sensory structure of the ear, and that's the sensory structure of the ear interprets that fluid movement as sound, as hearing. And so these bones help transmit that sound information from the tympanic membrane to the sensory structure of the ear. That's called the cochlea. And here's a dime per scale here, just to give you an idea of how small these bones are. But we have some of these in lab, so I'll make sure that we take a look at these in lab when we get to that point. The largest of the bones of the skeletal system in the human body is the femur. So this is the longest of the bones in the skeleton, but it's also the strongest bone in the body because it has to bear the weight of the vertebral column, the pelvic girdle, and essentially all of the organs and structures that are above it at the hip. So this is one of the strongest bones in the body. So we'll take a look briefly at the external and internal anatomy of bones as an organ, and we're going to use a humerus, or at least the book has a diagram of a humerus, that is the bone in the arm, which is the region between the shoulder and the elbow there, as essentially our example bone here. What they've kind of done is they've sectioned it coronally here so that we can see inside of it, and we can see the spongy bone and a cavity within it. And so we'll take a look at that as essentially our example bone. Long bones in general, because the humerus is a long bone, long bones generally articulate or connect to other bones at their very ends. That is, they make a connection with a bone at what's called the proximal end here, and they make a connection with another bone at what's called the distal end here. And you'll notice that in the long bones that the ends where they make articulations, or the ends where the articulations are found with other bones, are expanded or slightly expanded a little bit. And so we call these expanded ends of our long bone, we call those the epiphyses. And so this one just happens to be what's called the proximal epiphysis because it makes contact with the scapula or the shoulder blade. So this is the region that connects the humerus to the shoulder blade here. At the distal end, this is what's called the distal epiphysis, and this is where the bones of the forearm, that is the radius and the ulna, are going to articulate with at the elbow joint. And then because we had the two expanded ends of the long bone here, the epiphyses, they're connected by a long sort of shaft segment in the middle of the bone, and we call that the diaphysis. At the epiphyses, because the epiphyses make a joint or make a connection with another bone, the epiphyses are usually capped with a thin layer of cartilage that you see here, and this cartilage just happens to be hyaline cartilage. And we identified this back in the beginning of chapter 6. This is what's called the articular cartilage, simply because it allows, or it's found in what are called the articulations, or the joints of this particular bone. So this cartilage is found kind of capping the bone where another bone will make contact or make a joint with this bone here. The reason for that is that cartilage helps provide essentially a protective layer so that the bones at this joint can glide over and slide over one another easily during movement without incurring any damage as a result of that movement. So as I mentioned, this cartilage is hyaline cartilage, and it's referred to as articular cartilage. Okay. As we discussed earlier, the inside of bones is generally not solid. The bones, and in this case the long bones in particular, make use of spongy bone in the epiphyses to give the bones internal support, but also to make sure that the bones are not unnecessarily heavy by being solid structures. So usually we see in the interior of the epiphyses, we see spongy bone. And as I mentioned, this helps keep the epiphyses supportive, but keeps the overall bone weight down. So it helps keep the bone lightweight, so that the skeleton is not unnecessarily heavy. In the diaphysis of long bones, we usually have a cavity that opens up that stores yellow bone marrow, and this cavity is not surprisingly referred to as the medullary cavity. And then the compact bone that we saw earlier when we discussed bone tissue usually makes up the walls or the superficial walls of the long bone, In this case, it's the superficial walls around the epiphyses are made of compact bone, and the diaphysis is mostly made of compact bone, as there's usually very little spongy bone kind of in the medullary cavity area. The spongy bone, as I mentioned, I introduced this material called red bone marrow back at the beginning of Chapter 6. Usually the spongy bone that's associated with flat and irregular bones is filled with red bone marrow. And recall that this red bone marrow, its primary function is to make new red blood cells. So red blood cells that are circulating in the cardiovascular system, they don't have a nucleus, and so that means that they can't make proteins and they can't undergo mitosis. So they depend on red bone marrow to replace them when they begin to die and break down. Okay, so many of the, like I mentioned, many of the flat and irregular bones have red bone marrow associated within the spongy bone located in there, and the ribs are it seems like the ribs are a type of long bone, but these are actually a flat bone that's curved. So the ribs are technically considered a flat bone. Most of the cranial bones, as I mentioned, are flat bones, but there's a few irregular bones in there. The vertebrae, which is an irregular bone, has red bone marrow located within it. And the sternum here, which makes up the anterior part of the thoracic cage, also has red bone marrow in it, as well as the pelvis here. So these are the bones of the pelvic girdle or the pelvis. And as I mentioned, their function is to produce and create new red blood cells. So let's briefly take a look at the structures and the materials that are found within the diaphysis of the long bone. I talked a little bit about the yellow marrow, and I gave you the name for it here. But yellow marrow is the material that would fill the medullary cavity here. In this diagram here, they removed it so you could see some of the blood vessels and things that are winding their way through the compact bone. But normally in living bone tissue, the yellow marrow would occupy this space that's found here. Going back to Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, yellow bone marrow is made out of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is mostly stores lipids inside of it, and so recall that lipids are able to be used by the body to create ATP energy. We also see a number of blood vessels that make their way through openings, external openings in the bone here. These external openings are referred to as nutrient foramina, and the blood vessels essentially can use those to get into the internal part of bone, as blood vessels are really, really abundant in bones, and so they essentially thread their way through, making sure that they're delivering adequate nutrients and oxygen to all of the cells that are active in building or breaking down bone tissue. Here in this diagram too, we also see that the bone has an external connective tissue covering associated with it, and this external connective tissue covering is what's called the periosteum. The periosteum has a couple of different functions associated with it. It's a site for muscle attachment, so that tendons that come off of muscles and attach to the bones aren't easily kind of peeled away from the bones when muscles contract forcefully. And the periosteum also helps to provide an anchoring point for blood vessels and nerves that are associated with the bones. The periosteum essentially has two layers, and so we'll take a look, because the periosteum makes up the most superficial, or is a superficial covering around bone tissue. We'll start with kind of a simple diagram here of some bone tissue here, and we'll look at the two layers that make up the periosteum. So there's a layer that's essentially it's the deepest layer of the periosteum that sits flush up against the bone tissue here, contains those osteogenic cells. So these are the stem cells of bone tissue that undergo mitosis, and when they receive the proper signal, will some of those osteogenic cells will become osteoblasts, which are going to form bone tissue. So there's a layer of osteogenic cells, or a layer of bone stem cells that makes physical contact with the bone tissue in this periosteum. The most superficial layer of the periosteum is a dense irregular connective tissue, so it's a completely different tissue type. and this is what helps to give the external surface of the bone a nice, solid, tough connective tissue that muscles and blood vessels and nerves can anchor to without any problems of them being peeled away. Likewise, the internal surface of bones that is in the medullary cavity and even within the spongy bone itself is covered with a tissue that's called endosteum. And really the endosteum is a single layer, a very thin layer of osteogenic cells. So again, we have those stem cells of bone tissue that are in close association with the bone tissue itself. So kind of looking at a cross-section through a bone here, we've got the compact bone in the wall here. We've got the thin layer of endosteum here that are made of osteogenic cells. We can even see a couple of osteocytes here in the compact bone. And then kind of in the deeper part of it, this is the characteristic appearance of adipose tissue here. So this is these wide open spaces are the lipid-filled parts of adipose tissue that we're seeing there. So just to recap that, what we're looking at is that bone tissue is essentially surrounded by two very thin layers of osteogenic cells. That is, the endosteum is a thin layer of osteogenic cells, and the deep layer of the periosteum, which makes up the superficial covering of bone tissue. These are both made out of osteogenic cells, and so we have we have stem cells of bone that are in very close association with the bone tissue itself. And then the most superficial layer of the periosteum there is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that provides a good tough anchoring point for muscles and tendons and nerves and blood vessels.